Hi, folks. Roger Green here from the Academy Sacred Geometry. And I'm really honored to have three amazing people here today for this interview. And we're celebrating the release of a book called The Rest of Euclid. And I'm here with Vandorn, Scott, and Steve. And we're going to take you through this whole analysis of this new book. We're going to let you know about the human story behind the book, and we've got a couple of presentations for you. I'm going to hand it over to Vandorn to let us know about the background, your work with Robert, and how the book came to be.
All right. Well, I'd like to introduce myself, Vandorn Hinnant, and I have been engaged with the concept of sacred geometry since the mid-'80s. And when I met Robert Lee Powell Sr. in 1989, the volume and the temperature was turned up in the room. And it was a dialogue that was begun where I was his student simply because he was teaching what he understood about sacred geometry. So we had a very interesting running start in 1989 when I first met him. And right out the gate, I took something that was called the 12 pages, which was a class he was teaching, which actually takes you through this process of drawing circles and lines on a two-dimensional plane and looking at the relationships between the A circle and the B circle, these two circles that share a radius. And then you have the third circle that we would name the C circle. And then the fourth circle we would name the D circle. So those first four circles gives you an opportunity to draw two equilateral triangles in relationship to one another where they share an edge. And so from there, the process of the 12 pages takes you through understanding where to draw the lines in relation to the intersections of circles with circles. And then you go on to figure out how to do five-fold symmetry. So there's four-fold symmetry that's emphasized in a small way in the 12 pages, and then we go from three-fold symmetry to four-fold symmetry and then to five-fold symmetry. And so that's my introduction to Robert Lee Powell's teaching methodology. And from there, it just mushroomed into this larger conversation, which he had already been engaged with John Biggers starting in 1978 back at Texas Southern in Houston, Texas. And so what they did is they began this deep dive into ancient mathematics by way of geometry. And we had the pyramids at the Giza Plateau, which was a focal point because John Biggers had a very serious interest in that. And that was Powell's springboard, if I may, in terms of becoming very much engaged in the question, the inquiry of what is sacred geometry. So from there, the conversation ran from one decade to another, and he was always engaging as many people as possible in this study that he was completely immersed in. And just for the record, Powell did more drawings than we can ever know. A lot of them were damaged in a torrent of rain in one of the houses that he had in Houston. So in 1998, I went down to try to recover drawings that were damaged, and we had so many drawings that we lost. And Scott already knows this. These drawings are simply beyond exquisite. And I apologize for not actually having some to share on screen. And what you will see in the book titled The Rest of Euclid are simply a reference to the genesis of the drawings that were developed in the future. Scott does have a presentation where he can share some of those images, or maybe one or two. But yes, there's the cover of the book, The Rest of Euclid. And the image in there is a work of art of mine that we decided to use on the cover, which actually is, once again, you have these two circles that share a radius, and then where those two circles intersect, you have two more points. And so that makes it possible to draw the two equilateral triangles nested inside of what we call the vesica Piscis. And so some of you who are students of sacred geometry know that term. And there's the back of the book. And we included a small fragment of one of the, I guess you may say, historical documents that is attributed to Euclid, the elements, that's that small segment in the middle. It's actually a scrap from one of the ancient texts.
So when did this whole process of this book begin with Robert? And then you came in later and helped with the editing of it with Marnie Muller, etc. So when did it actually start? About 20 years ago, or?
Yeah, but you know, it's interesting. I am not certain. He was always writing. That's the problem. Powell was always writing, recording his ideas. So I actually sleep with a book under my pillow, which is an earlier version of this book without this title. And in fact, I can't even tell you the name of the book. But and some of us know that you can learn through osmosis by having something in proximity to you. And this is the way I've always been. So yeah, this book began so long ago. I don't have an exact date, but he began writing probably right after he began his deep dive into the work so that he could actually compile his thoughts. He was a scientist. So in a manner of speaking, he didn't have any choice but to write about what he was uncovering and discovering. And so he wrote for decades. And I would say that the version that I'm sleeping with under my pillow might be from the late 90s. Okay, that's just a guess. Maybe 1998 version. So once again, but even before that, there were lots of papers that he wrote, and he would title the papers. But where he landed on the notion to call it the Rest of Euclid, I am uncertain. I'm guessing it could have happened in the late 90s or by the early 2000s, because by 2004, he had compiled all of these thoughts into the book titled The Rest of Euclid. So the book could have been published in 2004, but our attempt to edit it was challenged because he was on again, off again about publishing the book, on again, off again about how it would look in terms of the content. It's actually an unfinished book even today. So there are lots of thoughts that he approached that are in the back of the book that don't get fleshed out in conversation. But that's okay. It's put there because the idea is that we wanted to publish it the way it looked in 2004. So that's basically what we have. We basically have a 2004 version of the book that's now been published, simply edited and lots of drawings redone for the purpose of the world distribution of the book and to actually have it look like a professional work of art. So that's what we have now.
And then how did you first meet him, and what was your inspiration around getting involved with sacred geometry? I mean, your background is, would you say, more of an artistic background? And in this book, we've got this beautiful blending between physics and mathematics and art. So how did you first get involved?
Well, I was in graduate school at UNCG, and one of our professors, one of my professors, I was studying, first I was there as an undergraduate student, taking classes even though I was at A&T State University. And so one of my graduate school professors said to me to let nature be your teacher. And in the process of him doing that, I went to the bookstore at UNCG and found Georgie Dotze's book, The Power of Limits. So I was introduced to the concepts of sacred geometry long before I met Powell. When I met Powell, it was simply, oh, this is on. And I had actually had experience drafting starting in the 8th grade. So in junior high school, I was drafting from the 8th grade all the way through the 12th grade, and never had any idea that I would land in this area of intellectual knowledge that we call sacred geometry. So when I met Powell, his 12 pages, he was actually talking about sacred geometry, and his focus was on sacred geometry. Once again, the only reason this conversation changed to this more technical focus was to help scientists, people in the field of mathematics and the sciences, to be able to comprehend what it means to do fractal mathematics in the plane. And that's what this book is for. It's an offering. It's a love offering to the scientific community, to give individuals in the scientific community an opportunity to embrace the idea that you can actually do mathematics by way of what we call nature's numbers, which are the square roots and their divisions.
Scott, when did you first meet Vandorn?
It would have been 1999, I believe, when we went to Sugar Mountain and did a retreat.
And Robert was there, yeah?
Oh, there was Robert. Well, yeah, Robert was the key individual, with the
Right,
rest of us working together. He was our teacher, really.
right. So Scott, you've got a let's have a little look at the book. You
Okay,
can do your dot camera thing there and share the screen if you like. And while you're
give
just
me
putting,
one. Give me
yep,
1 second, because I've got a cat that's
yep.
meandered in, and I've got to remove. Otherwise, it'll be a problem. So if you
And
don't
no,
mind.
that's fine because
Okay.
let's hear from Steve Bass. So Steve is with us today. Steve, just give a little introduction. Let us know what you're up to.
Sure. Well, I've had a career as an architect for many, many years, and I've always been interested even since I was a child. It's interesting you mentioned that you started drafting when you were what, 8 or 9? Well, I started drafting when I was 9. My father showed me how to do that, and I've been involved with that ever since. And it's that merger of the geometrical tightness with the looseness of the fine arts that's always been my interest. Um, and it led me after a while to study classical architecture, for one thing, as opposed to modern architecture, which is a very different thing. And then to go into the works of Plato, who uses number as basis for his cosmos. And to get that, to have an understanding of that theory, I had a wonderful teacher, Keith Critchlow, who led me through these things. And so I was able to mix the making of classical architecture with the theory, with the numerical theories of Plato, and that's the basis of my teaching and the book that I wrote about these things.
Your book came out about what? Two years?
By 2019, I think it came out.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll hear
And,
a bit more about your book later.
okay.
So Scott, how are you going there with your cat and your dot camera?
Everything's fine. Okay. Give me 1 second. Share screen. Okay.
Nice. So here's the book,
You can see.
folks.
Mhm.
And Scott has done a good review of it.
Oh,
But Vandorn, it'll be good to and it'll be good to hear everybody's sort of little definition of sacred geometry just off the top of your hat. Vandorn, do you want to just start?
Yes, I'd love to review that comment that I share with you. This is a fresh revision of a definition of sacred geometry, my definition of sacred geometry. Sacred geometry can be viewed as a system of analysis that humans use to identify with the naturally occurring patterns found throughout the elemental kingdom and in all of nature. Being engaged with sacred geometry, either as a direct experience, that is creating drawings, or as a witness, makes possible the fostering of a deeper connection with the naturally occurring patterns existing in our biology, in our psychology, and throughout the world of nature. This engagement fosters a reverence for all things natural. This engagement serves as a way of becoming more in tune with the sacred dimensions of nature and assists us with becoming more vibrationally attuned to the harmonic frequencies of nature. So that's fresh, that rose in my awareness between last night and this morning. So I'm always having to catch these ideas and write them down so that they can be shared. So it's a new variation on the theme, what does sacred geometry mean to Vandorn Hinnant? Yes.
And is this the first publication that you've been involved with?
No, actually, let me show you. This is the first publication. It's titled Paths to the Infinite, Finding Your Sacred Center. And so Paths to the Infinite, Finding Your Sacred Center happens to be a transcription of an interview that took place a few years ago. And someone said that this would make a wonderful book. So my wife said, I want to gift this book to my husband as a birthday present. And it was so much work involved that I had to get involved and help with all of the work that needed to be done so it could be published. But anyway, that was published about 2 years ago. And this is the second book. And I'm about to come out now with a book of poems, which has to do with the phenomenon of love or the subject of love. Not romantic love, but just love in general. So that's a book that's 30 years in the makes, and it will be published in February. Yes.
And that pathway to the infinite there, is that available to
Yes, it
through
is. It is
Amazon? You know?
It is available via Amazon. Yes, thank you.
Right. Well, I'll put that down in our notes later. So, but you've exhibited your artwork pretty much left, right, and center.
What's interesting is that I grew up in Greensboro, North Carolina. I had my first solo exhibition at age 18, downtown Greensboro at a photographer's studio. So he had this large studio in the front of his photography studio, and he gave me a solo exhibition. So from there, in 1980, I ended up being in a group exhibition at the old North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh. And it was an exhibition that was guest curated by one of my elders who happened to live down the street from me. And she was the wife of a dentist, but she was a lifetime artist and an arts educator, and who actually founded a group that I was a member of, still am a member of, titled the African American Atelier. And so Eva Hamlin Miller guest curated this exhibition. I was maybe 28, I believe, one of the youngest artists in the group exhibition. I had 2 works of art in the show. So that was sort of like a springboard for me, and it inspired me to actually say, I can do this. Anybody that makes an effort to stand in the world as a visual artist will find themselves challenged with all kinds of obstacles and what have you. And since I was really not speaking to the general public in terms of what we say consensus reality, I'm presenting what are conveniently called abstractions, and those aren't understood for the most part in modern times because the conversation has been transferred from the mythopoetic to the technical and the mechanical and the photographic, and an identification with self, as in the human persona and the physical body. So the mythopoetic that our ancestors were fully engaged with has been lost and subjugated, if I may, in these more modern conversations that are afoot in the world. So my work isn't really understood, even though people get it energetically, those who are open and sensitive. But for the most part, the masses can't see the relevance because of how they have been entrained towards these other senses of identification. So, but I still go. I mean, I've been doing this all of my life. What are conveniently called abstractions, I think of them as being the sacred geometry and the organic abstractions that I do, related to our ancient knowledge of our ancient ways in terms of the deep knowing that humans walk with. I was just watching evidence of, what's the guy's name? Michael Tellinger, talking about the ancient Aboriginal people and the song lines that they were aware of, and how these songs were informing what surfaces on the planet in terms of formations. So it was a brilliant presentation that he brought to our attention, but I was fascinated with the idea that sound is at the foundation of all that is. And I really don't know which way to talk about it. For me, my teachings from the past, my spiritual teachings from the past, I was informed that light and sound are all that there is. And so we can go back to Judeo-Christianity. We can go back to many ancient ways of knowing and understand that the light and sound are being talked about in different ways, but it's spoken of in a way that is, once again, is mythological and poetic, but it's alluding to what we conveniently call scientific facts. Today, we have uncovered through science, through modern science, that the photon, what the photon really is, and that there really is no solid matter, that there's just vibration and frequencies. And so
standing waves.
Yeah. So we have lots of concepts about how that gets to be and what that means. And different people, one group over here says it's this, and one group over here says it's that. And it really doesn't matter which group is speaking. They're all telling the truth. It's just like watching the elephant from 8 different vantage points, right? Are you looking at the elephant's nose or at his hind leg? You see?
There you go.
It's still the elephant, right? We're all talking
Yeah.
about the elephant. We're just looking at it from different vantage points.
I never thought of it as the elephant in the room. I always thought of it as the diamond in the room.
I've never heard the diamond in the room. Yes. That's a beautiful way of looking at it, right? All of the facets of the diamond.
So
Yes.
somewhere between the elephant and the diamond, huh? Hey, Scott, you've got your dot camera there. Let's have a look at the book.
Alrighty. I highlighted a few things in here, but possibly Vandorn would like to speak. In the very beginning, you speak of discovering an extraordinary means of performing fractal number arithmetic with the circle.
Yeah. So what happens is, you want to show
Go
some
ahead.
more? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll show more, but
right. What Scott, if we can forward to a diagram real quick, and that will make it easy to have a visual. Yes. Any of them will work, right? So
well, there's one in particular, I think.
Yes.
Like
Yeah,
starting here.
We can use that one, right? So you have two circles in relation to one another. This was proposition 1, Euclid's Elements, proposition 1, book 1, where given 2 points on a plane create a triangle. And that's not exact, I'm paraphrasing. But what happens is when you place 2 circles in relationship with one another where they share a radius, so from the A point to the B point, we would call that in the teachings that we have created, we call that the square root of 1. So that's the starting point in terms of talking about the square root numbers. And then, Scott, if you could go over to the other page, to the page on the other side. So that is, you see those two primary circles in the middle of this diagram. Well, that is actually the beginning of what I call Jacob's ladder, where you actually go up this vertical axis in the plane, and you can actually show the relationship between the square root of 1 and the square root of 2, the relationship between the square root of 1 and the square root of 3, the relationship between the square root of 1 and the square root of 4. So there's this interesting book that was published a long time ago in the 20s, and the guy's name eludes me now. I forgot. I apologize. Everybody would know his name. Elements of Dynamic Symmetry. Okay, what is his name?
J. Hambidge.
J. Hambidge, right. And so it's interesting. I didn't expect to say this, but what I have found as being a student of sacred geometry, and that includes studying with Keith Pritchlow in 1999 and Jason, his son-in-law, what I have found to be one of my pet peeves is people showing these diagrams and they leave out the circles that are absolutely necessary in generating the conversation called relationship. So what happens is with J. Hambidge, he has all of these beautiful diagrams. He calls it a root 1, root 2, root 3, root 4, root 5 rectangle, but he doesn't show you any circles. And so my pet peeve and my argument has always been, why are we leaving out that which is absolutely necessary for the creation of these relationships? A right angle. You don't have a right angle that shows up without circles to justify it. So this is one of the arguments that can be said to be put forth in this thesis. When you generate a relationship between lines, those relationships are dependent, fully dependent upon circles in relationship to one another. So that diagram is simply the beginning, the way to begin to educate oneself in being able to see these beautiful dynamic relationships in the plane. Because if you look at the point that says B, which is centered at the small circle on the right-hand side, the black circle, and then the point that says B prime, and Scott, you can point to that. Yeah, B prime point.
So
from B, yeah, from B to B prime, yeah, that is the square root of 3. Now, how can you justify that? How can anyone justify that? One would have to become familiar with this progression and with these dynamics. But it is impossible for me to tell anyone how Powell came into this understanding. That was never probed in terms of my relationship to him. I simply had to trust him. But watching what our beautiful Robert Lawler gave us in the book titled Sacred Geometry, looking at that, studying that book, and studying other people's writings. And I do want to suggest to us all that it was Robert Lawler's book that comes as close as humanly possible in my small exploration of what's been put out there on sacred geometry. It comes as close as I know to showing us that these circles are the way to generate these relationships called right angle, parallel, perpendicular. All of that can only be established by way of the relationship of circles with circles in the plane. So all that I have said is sort of like the platform, the springboard that one would use to become familiar with doing mathematics in the plane, and what I call fractal mathematics in the plane. But fractal only means divisions of a larger whole. So if you take, and some of the audience doesn't know this, but like when we say breaking symmetry, we're talking about dividing that which is complete into fractions. So the first division would be dividing a circle in half by drawing a line through the center of it. The second division would be a more complicated process, and Scott, it's in the book, I just don't know what page it is on, where you have the A circle, the B circle, and the C circle, and then you have lines drawn. It would be diagram figure number 9, maybe. And once again, I don't know where those figures are in the book, but we do have, for individuals who are attempting a study of the geometry by way of this book, we actually have a very thorough mapping. Yes, we can use that diagram right there. So it's more complex, but you see these lines, and you see the lines that, let's see now, the green lines, right? The green lines give you the what we call the square root lengths. So from A to A prime, and from B to B prime, and then from C to C prime, that's also a green line, right down the center. Yes, and that's B to B prime, and then C to C prime, right? And then the O point is in the very center of the complex. And so those who have studied Cartesian coordinates would say, oh, you have the vertical axis and the horizontal axis. Well, with the rest of Euclid, we're not talking about Cartesian coordinates. We're talking about what I consider to be a more evolved or more elaborate layout, where you have threefold symmetry and you have fivefold symmetry. So, and I do want to suggest to us that I believe that some of these individuals from our past knew about what is disclosed in this book, but they did not talk about it for fear of their life being terminated, right? In other words, they didn't want to be looked at as heretics. So, we have some of these, and Scott may know of some of these individuals, but of course we have the beautiful figure named Giordano Bruno, who was actually burned at the stake for heresy. And we have Sir Isaac Newton, who knew things that he could not say during his time. Many of these historical figures I believe, knew a lot about sacred geometry, but they couldn't talk about it because it was ahead of the curve, if I may, of consciousness. And so in order to remain corporeal, they kept their mouths shut and maybe tried to publish something, not publish something, but write something down, code it, hide it. So, Scott, do you know any of those stories?
Well, yeah, it may have something to do with the initiatory process. We're now finding out that many of them would study the quadrivium.
Yeah.
What's come down to is the quadrivium to prepare themselves for initiation. Yeah. And in initiation, the secrets of proportion were revealed, but there was a Sodalian oath: you must not reveal this openly. And that's why Plato kept his mouth shut. Hippasus, the Pythagorean, he revealed how to construct the dodecahedron, which required how to do the golden section. They put him in a boat, sent him out to sea, drowned him. So yes, they're very serious. That's why in the Eleusinian mysteries, it's so difficult to figure out what was revealed in the initiations there, yes, because they had to keep their mouths shut. Yep.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Well, that's it. That is it. That's the story. Roger, so where do we go from here?
Well, Scott might want to just take us on a little bit of a journey with his analysis of the book. You can go back to the beginning there, Scott, if you like, and point out some of the things that you sort of touch on here.
Okay, well, we did the thing about the fractal number arithmetic with the circle, and then some of these key points here, which is more kind of Vandorn's discussion about the gated community that Robert Powell was concerned about, where they outlawed basically the irrational numbers, the square root numbers. And really what's happening is they're reclaiming them on the number plane. And that's been a big problem in mathematics, with whether the line you have points infinitely divisible, or do you have discrete divisions? And as they point out, these irrational square root numbers are the numbers of nature. And this is where Keith Critchlow would agree with Robert Powell completely. This is the key. And the elegance and precision of the square root numbers reveal this deeper level of structure and of resolution. And one of the key figures that was very important to Robert Powell was Dan Pedo. And he was one of my teachers that we'll see later real quickly when we look at some of the slides. And again, there are three canonical algorithms: the root 3, the root 2, and then the golden mean. But both versions, and Plato called this the greater and the lesser. And this was the big secret for Plato, was what the heck do they mean by the indefinite dyad of the greater and the lesser? Well, it turns out to be the golden ratio, and it's reciprocal.
Yes.
So one of the instigators was Gauss for some of the ideas that Robert Powell had, were equations defining sections of a circumference. So now, instead of the line, we're starting to get into the circle, and then even into the sphere eventually. And of course, he would fix the point's location in a plane by assigning a number pair of coordinates, giving its distance from two mutually perpendicular reference lines. And you get this canonical hierarchy of three coordinate number base systems. And so again, you get your root 3, but notice how this square root of 1 is always going to be involved. So you have your root 3, your root 2, and then, as he points out, arguably the most intelligent number system basis possible in a mathematic system, golden ratio, and it's reciprocal.
And Scott, that's where
Yes.
when we make reference to that, we're talking about nature's numbers in particular, that all that grows in nature, which was disclosed in Giorgio Dozzi's book titled The Power of Limits. We're actually talking about nature's numbers, the fractal divisions of nature's numbers. So as everyone on this conversation knows, you start off with your digits of your fingers. You know, everybody that knows anything about sacred geometry uses this in their presentation. Michael Snyder, Scott Olsen, Robert Lawler, on and on and on. We go all the way back to the Vitruvian man and further, seeing evidence of our understanding of how the golden proportion factors in the growth and the development of physical bodies in nature. So the human body is throughout the human body, is throughout, and the beautiful thing about Giorgio Dozzi's book, which I can't emphasize enough, is the fact that he shows you references to these proportions. So this book is simply a way of helping, once again, the scientific mind become attuned to this notion that there is something to the square root numbers, and that they can be factored in the plane, as in divided. And so you have the, I don't know where it is in the book, but you take in the diagram or in the plane, you have the square root of 3. Oh, the image on the left hand side. It's very difficult to talk about this, but because I'm not able to talk about the color coding, but there are, let's see now. Yes, all of those little red dots, from one red dot to another one, that equals 1/3 of the square root of 3. Okay, so the distance between any of those red dots is 1/3 root 3. So what you have is you have this fractal pattern, and you have the square root of 1. Now there's another diagram. What's that, figure 24? There's a figure 25, Scott, that actually shows you, it's the same drawing, but you have what we call the root 1 lines included. And the root 1 lines give you, let's see now. So that diagram right there, the one on the left, okay. So the one below that, yes, the one below that, what you see is, you don't see the red dots, but you still see the intersections. But what happens is those black lines go from the center of one circle to another circle. All of those black lines equal the square root of 1. Well, if you see that the black lines are perpendicular to a green line, that means that all of the square root lines bisect a square root of 3 line. And then we have all of the square root of 3 lines trisect a square root of 3 line. And that can go on infinitely smaller, okay? And I have a drawing that we can't show, but I have a drawing that a friend of mine encouraged me to call the fractal brain. And it's a Koch crystal. For those who might know what the Koch or Koch, how do you pronounce that, Scott? The mathematician, with you take an equilateral triangle and you divide each edge into 1/3, and then you fold those two shorter lines up, and K-O-C-H. How do you pronounce that?
Oh, Coke? Is it Coke? I think.
Coach.
I believe.
Koch, yeah. Well, how it's pronounced? We're familiar with it. So I took that idea and I developed it into this exquisite fractal image that, once again, I regret that I don't have a representation of it. But when we look at what you have shown on the left-hand side of the page, Scott, that diagram there, that has everything to do with the square root of 2. You see this rectangular pattern that's emphasized with all of these colors, but every one of those diagonal lines inside of that heavily colored area, those diagonal lines happen to be subdivisions of what we will call a square. And so the AB point, and you have a vertical line going from the A. Well, anyways, too much to talk about. But let's just say that this particular drawing has everything to do, just as it is stated, with the square root of 2, a number fractal coordinate system. So that's an original vintage drawing from by Powell Sr., but he did many drawings talking about the square root of 2, the square root of 3, and the square root of 5. And it's impossible to place emphasis on that, but you can see the small squares, right? You see the small squares, all the small squares, you actually have the square root of 2 in the drawing, but it's not emphasized. So it's not easy to talk about it. But that is one of the drawings that has to do with the square root of 2. So all of those horizontal lines and vertical lines show smaller and smaller squares. So we're talking about fractal subdivisions of a square whose edges would be the square root of 1. And so that's what that is. It's a graphic representation of how to subdivide the line segment that we call the square root of 1, and how to subdivide the line segment that we call the square root of 2 into smaller and smaller subdivisions. So this is counting in the plane. Okay, that's as simplistic way to speak of that as I can momentarily, but hopefully that makes sense.
Sure. Scott, just take us through some of the other key points.
Okay, let's see, we've looked at this, I believe. Yes, okay. Just very quickly. And the point here that the powers of the golden mean and its reciprocal, the basis number system. So Robert Powell was constantly referring back again and again to the golden ratio as being so central to all of this. And even though this is generalizations of the Fibonacci number series, I looked very closely, and what came to mind is I realized you have here the Lucas numbers in sequence, 3, 4, 7, 11, 18, 29, etc. And Lucas numbers are, in my book, actually more special than Fibonacci's, but that's a whole nother game to talk about. And then, as he points out, Robert does, we assert that the computation machine language taught by the foregoing theory of the number plane is the complete code, the primary mathematical language truly used by nature. And that was, again, as I think Vandorn had pointed out, that was Robert's big beef, was they'd kind of outlawed the square root numbers on the plane or on the number line. And one thing I noticed here, which kind of comes back to a lot of my interest, it requires and awakens, and this is a Greek name, anagogic attention of the computer. That's abduction. That's novel hypothesis formation. It actually, it's like going from the Bohm's explicate order to figuring out what's lying behind it, namely the implicate order. And that's one place where Robert Powell was so tuned in to David Bohm and the significance of what that genius was all about. And then I guess here's a few more of the, you'll see again, Lucas numbers again and again and again. And then finally, the John Biggers thing. I actually have this in the other presentation if we want to look at it. But what Biggers was concerned about was the divine proportion and how Da Vinci used it. And so that's where you get into this. And ultimately, you see these positive and negative powers of the three fractal number integer vectors, he calls it, √3, √2, and the golden mean and its reciprocal. Those are the things that I had in the book.
Yeah,
Great.
We also had the Sugar Mountain retreat, but that's up to you guys. You want to
Yeah,
see
no,
that?
let's switch. Scott, if you could switch over to the presentation from the Sugar Mountain. Reminds me of that Neil Young song, Sugar Mountain.
I don't know that.
Yeah, I might have got the type very anyway. So just give us an introduction to this, Scott.
Well, I had two timeshares up at Sugar Mountain where we could house everybody. And so we had them come and everybody was comfortable. We had 2 floors in each timeshare, and we presented to one another. And here's Bob and myself outside the unit at the Sugar Mountain retreat. And this is really one of the things in the book that I took out and I wanted to kind of highlight, because this really tells some of what's really going on here. And I've got something in my way here, so I can't quite see it. But the construction of the right angle structures, that becomes key, because it allows for the Pythagorean theorem that allows for really precise measurements. And some of what you've been talking about, Vandorn, is the straight lines and you get the right angles, but then combined with the circles. And it's just incredible what happens. So this brilliant insight of Robert Powell lies in the designation of the referential line length. So instead of calling it 1, he looks at it as square root of 1. And it opened and expanded the countable mathematical landscape in which the current decimal counting system is actually a subset, is created by his feat of getting, the √1 in relationship to 1. So it occurred when he designated it as √1 as opposed to 1, which obviously allows you to have also the, get that out of the way, plus and minus 1. So it allows precise calculations that are commensurate with nature, as you've been pointing out, Vandorn, including calculations in utilizing pi, phi, and the nonlinear measures of the dynamics in the natural world. Already mentioned this, we've already seen it, so I'll just go on. We saw it in the book, but it's interesting that this is also exactly what Steve and my teachers point was all along that root 3, root 2, and the golden mean, they're at the center of all the constructions of architecture, etc., simply because they refer back to the triangle, the square, and the pentagon. So here during the retreat, we had the guys together. Let me see if I can move this. There we go. And Vandorn, if you want to mention, of course, this is Robert Powell here. This is Cecil, I guess I can mention, but you jump in at any point. There's yours truly. There's my roommate from college, Bill Foss, and his wife, Scotty. And there's Galileo Pedrosa in the background and his wife. And here we're presenting to one another during this retreat. And Bob was really our key figure. And we gather around and doing drawings and research here with Galileo Pedrosa, just a brilliant, brilliant individual who also has passed, unfortunately. Bob again showing us his drawings, the beginnings, and took us through it very, very carefully. And of course, in the background, we have the Fibonacci numbers in nature, and we'd have the Platonic and Archimedean solids, as we have here. And here he's pointing out, again, these particular points in these intersections. Again, if you want to say anything, Vandorn.
Well, where he has his two fingers would be the corner of a square above the AB line and the corner of a square below the AB line. So that length between those two fingers is actually the square root of 5.
Gotcha. Perfect. And of course, here he's showing us some of the work that he had done in the laboratory of Dennis Gabor on holograms. They had taken photos of the bottom of a tin can resonating in different frequencies. And this is one of the first photographs of holograms ever done. Am I correct, Vandorn? At least that's what Bob was telling us. Really interesting.
If that's what he stated, then I'll have to take his word at face
Yeah,
value.
and I think he's right. These are old photographs, but he would, I've used this again and again in my sacred geometry presentations to show how sound can be translated into form. It's always there. And of course, this is Jeremy Lyons, who was also at the retreat. You see here the root 2, root 3, root 4, root 5, etc., and different combinations with the Riemann Royal qubits, mega yards, different Roman pace, how these root numbers were used by the ancients who also were aware of this. That's what's really important. It's almost like some of the ancient knowledge of mathematics is more advanced, really, than the way we look at things. And here's Robert and Vandorn here. We're watching someone else present. Again, Robert with some of his beautiful drawings, with Jeremy. And this would be an example. I guess we don't really have, I wish I had more of the colored examples that you folks had, but at least I had this one. And here you are. And there's Galileo and Cecil. That's Galileo's golden section version of the Holy Grail. And Bob was always having such a great time. He's just really a great person too. Really funny, funny man. And here he's working with Galileo and they're looking at some of the slides. And on your account of yourself, if you can speak to this or I'll speak to it because I found this really interesting, the emphasis on relationship, because it's what the ancient Egyptians call the primordial scission, the logos. Before the logos occurs, before you have the division into two, probably at the golden cut, not the middle of the line, you don't have relationship. And really, sacred geometry is how the one transfers into the many. It's kind of like a holographic fractalization at self-similar, all the different levels. And the beauty of what you guys are trying to do there, taking STEM and turning it into STEAM by adding art into the teaching process, I found absolutely important and stunning. And then you mention Froebel, with the inventing of kindergarten, how he had these gifts, a group of wooden polyhedrons and a number of two-dimensional geometric drawings. And later, Buckminster Fuller was influenced by Froebel's solids and the drawings. And since the year 2011, you've been creating quite a body of work, including sculptures based entirely upon ancient wisdom and referred to in some circles as the golden proportion, divine proportion, golden section, golden mean. And then finally, your art making is part of a larger trans-temporal human endeavor towards a transformative vision for humankind. And I would say with your attitude and the way you're working is very similar to what I've been thinking all along now. It's all of nature is involved. It's not just humanity. It's beyond that. It's much bigger. And the love for all beings, all creatures. And this is Dan Pedo, who was my professor at the University of Minnesota and led to my writing my Platonic aesthetics summa cum laude thesis. And he got me to the University of London. But you look at some of his books here and you see the emphasis on circles as well. I think Bob was talking about the gentle art of mathematics or geometry in the visual arts. And again, he was so important to me, getting me to study with David Bohm in England. And they're two of the most important people, certainly in my life. And of course, in the book, again, this is not about me, but it led to developments in terms of this grand unification of the sciences with the one and the indefinite dyad, the greater and the lesser being big phi and little phi, and the reciprocals of each other. And then I don't know if we don't need to, let's see, how do I guess I'll do it. Out of the golden rectangle, we can get the, what I call the golden chalice of Orion, which gives you your root 2, giving you your squares, and you can see the Vesica Pisces in the background. I didn't have a compass move on this thing, so I simply took the original drawing and then kind of overlaid it. So this is exactly root 3, exactly root 2, approximately 1/2 root 2, very, very close. And these are also in gematria. You have the names of the gods here as well. This is the god Apollo. This is the god Hermes. This is square root of the golden mean. Actually, you can construct the pyramid semi, what am I trying to think of? The section through it. But here it is, the greater, lesser, square root of the greater, 1/2 root 2, exactly root 2, and root 3. And we did this with the book already, so I don't think we need to. Let me just see if there's anything else. Oh, I've already showed them.
Nice one, Scott. Beautiful. Thank you.
I'll try to run through that maybe a little rapidly, but just this is really Vandorn's show. And of course, we want to hear from Steve, not everything from me here.
So Steve, just tell us a little bit about your book and tell us about how you might see some crossovers between the two books and your whole experience of this.
Well, I've approached the similar subjects that we've been discussing here, but really from a different dimension or from a different direction. You know, you talk about the facets of the diamond. That was a nice image because I've really come at a different facet from these other two fellows here. And I'm not critical necessarily, although I am a little bit critical, but not really, not personally for sure. But I've tried to, how can I say it, make a distinction between thinking modern and thinking ancient. And I've really tried to think ancient as opposed to think modern. And I have certain criticisms about the modern world and modernism. and about science and the way science has been used, not science itself as a process, that's neutral, but the way it's been used in what's called scientism, where science has replaced spirituality. Well, the attempt has been, as Vandorn has pointed out, I think, there's been an attempt to replace the human spirit with abstractions. And I don't think that's going to go anywhere. I don't think it's going to get us anywhere. You know, I'm not a person who believes in what's called progress. If you study Platonism, you know, it was Plato starts in the Golden Age, and you go downhill from there. And we're going downhill from there. We're really going downhill. And the further you get into modern physics, the further downhill you get. And there's got to be something that's got to be done. You know, there's a lot of problems in like modern physics cosmologies, and they can be solved by going back to number rather than going further into mathematics.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and especially as in my career, as I've tried to merge the idea of geometry as not as a science really, but as an art form, and to try to merge that what I would call the tightness of geometry with the openness of the fine arts. And so when I began to practice architecture, and it was a long time ago now, I was in the mid 1970s, God help us. I realized that my training had not prepared me for any kind of self-analysis, so that I could look at my work and know whether it was deficient or not, and in what way it was deficient, and change it and improve it. Sometimes I could hit it, and sometimes I couldn't, and I didn't know why. Right, so I started reading, and I read a bunch of modern stuff, and it didn't make a lot of sense. And I finally read this ancient book that we have from the architect Vitruvius. And in Vitruvius, he gives you a theory of how to create architecture. It's classical architecture, of course, but it's a way of using these number systems that are described by Plato to create architecture. And I got very fascinated by that. And I found the work of Keith Critchlow and associated myself with him for a number of years. And was very fruitful association. As I said, he took me through works of Plato, particularly the Timaeus and the Republic, the Timaeus, and a few others, the Meno, I don't know, a few other diagrams that I'm forgetting right now. But and he showed me where these numbers occur and how Plato used those numbers. And I began to be able to integrate that with my study of classical architecture. Because in classical architecture, there's a kit of parts that you use over and over again. And those parts are described in a series of works referred to as the canon. That's a little bit of a religious name, which I don't like, but it's a series of reference books that have come down since the Renaissance. It starts with Vitruvius. There's nothing for a long time. And then in the Renaissance, you get a series of these books. And then into the Enlightenment that describe these classical elements through the use of number and geometry. But again, if you approach it mathematically, you won't get anything. You won't get anywhere, in my humble opinion. You got to understand number as a quality or as a series of qualities. So rather than the quantity of 3, you want to understand the quality of 3-ness. What does it mean to be 3, right? And if you can figure that out, you know, if you can, there's a canon, you know, again, who was this man? Oh God, in the 18th century, who translated a lot of Plato. I'm terrible on names now. I've had some health problems, and I got not
Thomas Taylor.
Thomas Taylor, exactly. Thank you, Scott. And yeah, Thomas Taylor wrote this book called The Theoretic Arithmetic of the Pythagoreans, where he lays it out for you. He tells you what the story was, and he gives you the associations to the gods. So you just mentioned that the names of the gods are numbers. Well, they're numbers, yeah. And he tells you which gods are which numbers, basically, in that book. And I was able to make use of it. I don't know if I can find it and show. You know, I didn't prepare anything for this, sort of deliberately. But I did. Oh God, where's so I can't find anything in short order, but
Just
I'm trying
for one thing,
anyway, I'm trying to
show
find.
the cover of your book up
Oh, I
there.
can show the cover. Yeah, definitely
Yeah.
the cover.
So
I'll show you the
and
cover.
just tell us the title.
It's Beauty, Memory, Unity. Because in the philosophy of Plato, there or in the Neoplatonists, it's not really in Plato, but it's in again, who's the big Neoplatonist? Plotinus. He talks about a theory of beauty. And beauty, he tells you, is the memory of unity. It's the joy of the soul as it remembers its unity with the divine, with the cosmos itself. And that's the experience of beauty. And that's very interesting because nobody talked about it like that. I hadn't heard anybody talk about it like that. And it's a nice, clear definition, and you know what you're working for, right? In the Platonic system, the soul starts with the divine in the divine realm, and it descends. It makes a descent into the divine realm, and then it maintains itself in incarnation, in a physical incarnation, and then it returns back to the one. It drops its incarnation and returns back to the one. Now, whether you believe in reincarnation or not, I don't know. Plato did, obviously, but the idea of that you how did he say it? You proceed in the good, proceeds from the good because the Creator was good and wanted everything that could possibly exist to experience that goodness and created the universe in order to do that. Right? That's the explanation, which I think is a very nice explanation of why we're here, as opposed to random molecules bouncing around somewhere. But okay, so you proceed, and then you have to maintain, and then you have to return. And the proceeding mode is what am I getting at here? There's a proceeding mode, and then you proceed through the law or through what they call dharma, or what did the Egyptians call it? I forget. Not karma. They call it something else in Egypt. But anyway, it was the law. The idea of the law, that there's natural law, and that's what these functions are showing us, how the natural laws work. But
the netters.
they're the netters, right? Well, that's what they were. They were called the gods. Yeah, the netters. That's not exactly what I was thinking of, but anyway. And then we return under the sign of the beautiful, right? So beauty is the way of returning. Now, the idea that when you descend, when the soul descends, it forgets where it came from, and forgets what it is, that it's a spiritual being, and it identifies with the body. So that for the classical education, the idea was remind you, and it's all about remembrance in Plato, because you started with the divine, so you knew everything at the beginning, but you forgot. See, so the idea is you got to remember what you are. This is why it says, know thyself. That's what they're talking about, is remembering what you actually are as a soul, as a spiritual being. And beauty is the stimulus to remember, of the stimulus for remembrance, basically. Right? This is the idea of beauty. So I come from the idea that how do I create things in a classical manner? You'd have to do it in a classical manner, because in modernism it doesn't work. Modernism is the opposite, values. So where classicism values order and stasis, modernism values disorder and movement. Right now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do any of this, right, or it's wrong, or in some way, but you got to know the difference. You have to understand the difference, I think, in order to create well. And if you can, and these principles, these root principles, are part of the methods of how you work with these things. I'm just going to try to find one or two things here if I can, because I did work on these things. Well, here's something that I managed to work out over a period of a few years. I know I got to get it on the camera here. Here it is. It's a classical portico using the squaring of the circle, right, and the pentagon as the guides for this. And it comes right out of the Platonic system, really. Now, it took me a while to realize it. But once you do it, you sort of got it. Okay, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. So there were two cosmologies involved here. One is this. Let's see if I can, again, I don't know where my camera is. Here it is.
Yeah, it comes up.
So we got 4 circles right at the top. You have unity, division, structure, and manifestation. Those are the 4 stages, right? And I've tried to have in the lower part here, I try to have a system of how you design something using those 4 stages as a concept, right? So it's a kind of an ancient idea how you can create architecture that has a character using these proportional systems. I get very detailed in the book. I'm not going to try to show it all here, but I would urge people, if you're interested in these subjects, try to get a hold of the book, and so that's really been my struggle, is to all of us really are trying to reinvent this system, because as Vandorn has said, the challenge is to rehumanize this whole thing, right? To somehow connect it back to humanity again, and you can make the arts relevant through that. And I know many people have worked on this. I think mostly in a modernist way, and I've tried to stay away from that. I was trained in modernism as an architect, of course, in abstraction, and again, when I tried to practice on my own, I realized that I had been given some tools, but I couldn't really analyze what was good and what was not good, and I needed to study something else. And I found these studies, which again, beauty is the key, because beauty is an expression of the good, right? The whole thing starts from the good, and if you're going to work in the arts, you have to try to turn people toward the good, or you work in anything really, in any medium. Your goal is to try to turn people toward the good, because that's what's going to point them upward and back to that level of return, which we're all going to return to anyway. And so the idea was to return consciously. If you could return consciously to the one, you might not have to repeat the trip. Right? I mean, in the East, they say that you have to keep coming back because the soul is imbalanced, or it has imbalances, and it has to keep coming back in order to work out those imbalances. But if you can awaken the knowledge that you had originally with the divine knowledge through these sacred concepts, you don't necessarily have to return, or you can return on a higher level in some way, right? So you're elevating yourself. So this is the idea. And if I'm going to create anything, it's going to be with that in mind, with how I can help people elevate themselves. And so I have avoided mathematics, or avoided modern mathematics. Not that it's wrong or bad. I'm not really criticizing it, but it's just something that I avoided because I didn't want to get into that headspace. And you have to think ancient. See, most people, most of the architects that I know who try to create classical architecture are basically modern people. And they're thinking modern, and they're trying to use the classical. And it doesn't quite come out as well as it should, because they're not thinking ancient. If you think in terms of these numbers, it's not, to me, it's not just the root rectangles or the root powers. They're important, but there's also the what I would call the rational ratios, right? 1 to 1, which is unity; 1 to 2, which is the octave; 2 to 3, which is the fifth; and 3 to 4, which is the fourth in music. And this is a series of rational ratios. Then there's a series of what I would call transrational ratios. See, modern science calls it irrational, but I don't like that term because that's a pejorative, and it gives you the whole thing away. It gives you the consciousness away right there. It's not irrational. It includes the rational, but more, because it's elevating you, right? It's using the rational to elevate you. It's using the experience of nature which is fractal. It grows like that because of these primary rules or primary laws of nature, right? That are acted out through these numbers. And it's not just the transrationals, but it's the rationals as well, because they cross. There's a certain point at which you get to, and you've seen it in these things that you've been showing. It's not clear, but if you go from 1 to 1, and you take the diagonal, and of course you get to the square root of 2, and then you get to take that diagonal and you get to the square root of 3, and you get that diagonal, you get to the square root of 4, which is 2, which is a whole number. So these things, they kind of wave through one another. They're the same system. They're different manifestations, or different facets of the diamond. And so this is where I've tried to work, and it's what that book is about. It's what my teaching was about for many years. And it's really been a wonderful trip for me. I figured something out for myself, and I was able to apply it in the world and teach it to people in a way that they could understand it and use it, I hope. And I hope I think some of them are, because some of my students, stay with me and come back. Yeah.
Steve, I wanted to suggest what you've stated about the transrational in relation to the rational. That's actually addressed in the thesis.
Oh, so, good.
Yeah, Bob talks about that. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah, this is part of the ancient approach to it. And, I don't know what his references were, but this all goes back to Plato. And Plato is kind of like a crossing point, where below Plato is the Neolithic. And if you read Critchlow's book, Time Stands Still, he tells you about how these things worked in the Neolithic. And they knew all these things. They knew all these principles in the Neolithic. They just didn't write them down because they didn't have the means to do it. So I'm not sure how I got there. I think I just lost my train of thought. But anyway,
well,
I'll give it back.
To speak about things from what we would conveniently call an historical perspective, we have a tremendous amount of information that has been, for the most part, hidden from the general public. Yep. It does exist. Yep. A tremendous amount of history. We know, well, some of us know what happened with the archives at the universities in Alexandria. Some of us know about that. Hypatia, that's a story that I forgot what, Scott, do you remember the name of that movie which about Hypatia?
I know the one you're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, right. Well, anyway, so one of my interesting experiences in life is that now a very special artist friend, Terry Atkins, one time I visited New York City, and he actually had gone to a used bookstore. His father was a mathematician, and he was also a graduate from Fisk University, just like Robert Lee Powell, Sr. So Terry Atkins had actually purchased a book for me titled "The Mathematics Necessary for the Understanding of Plato,"
right?
And which was a rare book.
Yeah, I know that book.
Yeah. Right. So I said, "Oh, fascinating." Yeah. So we have a tremendous amount of information that is not shared with the general public for one reason or another. But when we talk about Plato and Aristotle, so much information was warehoused in Alexandria and was, should I say, co-opted and hidden, and what have you, and other things happen. But I just want to say that we have so much rich history that isn't generally disclosed in conversations like this. So we have a tremendous amount of data that does go back to not who said it, but what was said, if that makes any sense. So, we have historical figures like Plato and Aristotle, et cetera, but above and beyond the names were actually the ideas that were part of the body of knowledge that was warehoused and taken care of for posterity. And once again, these curious interventions that took place, which I don't want to talk about momentarily, but everybody knows what I'm talking about. These curious interventions and co-optings and hiding of material. I mean, we could go back to ancient India. We could talk about ancient India and what was known there about these relationships. But once again, this is not talked about in the Western world much. And I don't want to get into a because, just want to say that it isn't. Yeah. So, but so the ancient knowledge has always been there and it remains available to us. It's just a matter of how we direct our attention back to that ancient knowledge and towards what ends. So that, that's the focus. That's the order of the day is, how do we collectively, those of us who know anything, how do we direct attention back to these ancient bodies of knowledge so that we can resacralize what we conveniently call the human condition and find our way up, as opposed to becoming more enmeshed in the grosser nature of human unconsciousness, if I may speak poetically and metaphorically.
That's an interesting term. Scott, final comments from Scott, and then we'll hand it over to Vandorn to just tell us about his other publication.
Sure. Just very quickly then, it's Agora that you were looking for, the name of the Hypatia film.
Yeah.
And a couple of things. And the good is, in the academy, was known as the one. And the principles of Plato were the one and the indefinite dyad. And the big question is, what the hell was the indefinite dyad? He gives enough clues, we can figure it out. Turns out it's the golden section and it's reciprocal. And at the summit of the cave, as Steve was talking about, returning to the good, to the one, before you get to the one, you come to truth and beauty. And it turns out, and you pick whichever one you want, I say the greater is beauty, because usually when you look at form and relationships, you're looking at the whole relative to the parts. Science, looking for truth, not scientism, but the real scientific method, the quest for truth, that's where you have the lesser version of the golden ratio. And here's what's so darn interesting. If you make it to the greater and the lesser, you discover that their geometric mean is 1. And you discover that their product is 1. Of course, that happens when you have reciprocals anyway, but that's the key there is their product is 1 because they're reciprocals of each other. And if you subtract them, you come back to the good, the 1. The 1 is there in every case. So it's the 1 and the indefinite dyad that's at the summit of the cave. And Steve is absolutely right. All of the imagery of the cave is to take you back up through what are known as the intermediate level of the mathematicals, up through the forms, up through these principles of the 1 and the indefinite dyad. And it takes you back there. And the other thing, if I may share screen, well, I'll do it. Yeah, let me do it very quickly, because it was something Steve brought up. If I can share screen very quickly, I'm going to do something that you see here. The reason that Bob was so interested in Dan Petto in his geometry and the visual arts is that he looked at it much like Steve is looking at it, from the perspective of Vitruvius. And hence, this is what became most important for him. The elegant construction depends on order, arrangement, eurythmy, propriety, symmetry, and economy. And symmetry is the proper arrangement between the members of the work. So this is really that ancient type of geometric constructions and mathematics that is so important, that was studied in the guilds and was really reemerged in the Renaissance. And that's why people like Da Vinci, working with Luca Pacioli, the monk drunk on beauty, who wrote about the golden section, all of that stuff is coming out. It was like reemerging there. And that's the beauty, Steve, of you. You and I may differ a little bit about science, because I can see the scientific method. I agree with you about the scientism, absolutely. but you're absolutely right in the direction you're going and bringing humanity back in. And all I would say is, having come from Bhutan, I have discovered that it isn't so much about escaping the wheel of rebirth yourself. It's teaching sacred geometry to others, which puts them into resonance with the divine. And it's the bodhisattva vow that is the real key, where you postpone your own enlightenment to
Very
help
nice.
others. And that's the basis of sacred geometry.
Very nice concept. Very nice.
That's it. All of you guys are beautiful to me, because all of this comes together. It's not really we're looking at it from different angles. And the other thing I'll say is that El Nashi taught me this in figuring out the solution to physics today. You can come at it from various angles, but guess what? The golden ratio, and then root 2, root 3 is at the core of the explanations. His route was through Cantorian space-time, the fractal geometry of Cantor. But he showed so many different ways of doing it. All of them, in the end, they're using the same sacred geometry. And what is sacred geometry? It's pure geometry. What's pure geometry? And this is going back to Lawler now. Pure geometry is geometry that links you to nature and the cosmos. And that's all I have to say.
The idea of the sacred in this is that the sacred is that which doesn't change. It's a principle that doesn't change, which is why it's sacred. That's what it means. And these are the principles that don't change. These root powers and the ratios of the octave and so on. These are the things that haven't changed at all. And you can go to India, you can go to China. We don't know enough about China now, but I'm sure they were there. Maybe they burned those, I don't know, but whatever. But this was always dangerous knowledge. It was always kept to a few people. It's very powerful, and it's our task, I think, in the modern world to open these things up in a positive way. It's unfortunately we've opened up a lot in a negative way as well, but you got to hope for humanity and that they'll do the right thing eventually. Yeah,
Steve and Vandorn, this is why Keith Critchlow pointed out that in the Timaeus, Plato could not openly describe how to construct a dodecahedron because it would require the golden ratio to be revealed. That was the big mystery of initiation in the mysteries. That was it.
right. And one of the things that I point out in one of my writings, it's not published, but it was given to students, is that Euclid, which is a work of what I would call towering lucidity, right? It's one of the most lucid things that's ever been done. That's why it lasted so long. He does not. He is very obscure about the golden section. He tells you in one part of the book, he sort of tells you how to construct it, but he doesn't name it. And then in the latter part of the book, he tells you how to use it, but he doesn't remind you that he has told you to construct it somewhere. He just says, do this. And he doesn't refer back to the other thing. Vitruvius does the same thing. He gives you the Vitruvian man because he can't just tell you about the golden section. And of course, the Vitruvian man turns up in India as well. So there was some kind of, we don't know which way it went really, whether it went from India to the West or from the West to India, but they used the same idea of the human being as the exemplar of the proportions. And of course, the golden section is all over the human being, and he can't name that. So he just gives you the thing, and he doesn't tell you, he doesn't remind you the fact that the navel is the golden section of the human being. He just says, oh, there's a navel, and you do a circle around the navel. And he doesn't tell you the rest of it, right? It's very funny. Then he goes into a discussion about a man named Hermogenes, which I thought was very interesting because it means born of Hermes, who was the divinity guarding subtle knowledge and ancient knowledge. And he gives you these number patterns that people have criticized in the modern world. All the modern architects think that it's just gibberish, or he's just making numbers up, But he's not. He's referring to Plato, and he refers to Plato numerous times during that work, to the point where I started to study Plato, because when I read him, I was studying classical architecture to learn how to use the elements. And he keeps talking about Plato, and, so eventually I said, well, I got to study Plato. And I knew that I couldn't study it at the academy because they're not going to teach it the way they need to teach it. And eventually I found Critchlow, who taught it the way it was supposed to be taught, the way it was originally taught, I think, or close to something like that. And so I was able to get the sense, I was able to begin to think old. And then I was able to actually create these works and begin to modulate them and play with them so that they dance to my tune. And you can see it being done. And then I wrote this long historical section in the book about how these ideas filter through the entire history of architecture that we have, starting with Egypt and going right down to Thomas Jefferson, really. So
I'm going to hand it over to Vandorn. Just to finish up now, there was another publication of yours, Vandorn. If you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, briefly, this book titled Paths to the Infinite, Finding Your Sacred Center. It is a transcript from an interview that took place over 2 years ago. And Mark Lee, who lives in Durham, North Carolina, interviewed me on his IBM TV program. And it went so well that someone suggested that it be turned into a book, and that's what we did. So this conversation that took place between myself and Mark Lee is basically me talking about my life journey as a visual artist. And I can't tell you that I can speak about the contents right now. I don't think about this book often because I've been so busy thinking about this book that just got published and the one that's coming after it, a book of poems. So, but it's there. One can actually take a look at it on Amazon. I'm not sure if any pages are available. Oh, watch this. This is the diagram, Scott, that I was talking about. That little drawing right there. Yeah, that little drawing right there is actually related to the Coach Crystal, if that's the way it's pronounced. And so, that drawing is actually the genesis for that drawing is 3 circles in relation to one another: the A circle, the B circle, and the C circle. So the intersection at the top, where the top of the vesica piscis, where you have 2 circles that share a radius, that intersection at the top, that's where you place your 3rd circle of the same radius, and that gives you 3 points. And those 3 points and the lines that were drawn beyond them is actually how that particular composition came into existence. So once again, the contents is only the story of my life walk as a visual artist. And I have lots of examples of visual images in here. In fact, one of my favorite images, which has been explored by other people, I have found, but this image right here, I called it A Light from Circle Island. And it happens to be 7 flower of life patterns combined with one another. And that was my genesis of an idea of how to do a variation on the theme Jacob's Ladder. So in the book, The Rest of Euclid, we have something called Jacob's Ladder. In this book is a diagram that I created I formalized it in 1999, but it began in 1998 as a contemplation on how to generate the square root, I'll use the word integers, from the center of this matrix, this field of circles. And I'm yet to formalize that and publish it. I've seen evidence of other people talking about the concept in the world, but maybe I will get to outpicture that. One of my dear friends, Marnie, has suggested, hey, you need to get that out there, and she's right. I do need to get it out there.
Good old Marnie.
Yeah. So, Marnie's constantly nudging me and pushing me to do this, do that. Sometimes I think of her as my admiral. Okay. Anyway, I think she would find some humor in that. At least I would hope so. But anyway, that book does tell an
available on Amazon as well. Both books are available on Amazon. I'll put those links into the the comments.
And the second book, The Rest of Euclid, is also available on Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble and Amazon, yeah.
Yes, both of those, right?
Okay. Yeah, I'll put those links down.
Right. I would lean towards advertising it on Barnes and Noble for reasons that I don't need to
Yeah,
speak.
yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Yeah,
I do
will
want to
do.
keep I do want to keep Barnes and Noble alive and well and in the game, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Support him, right? So there you go.
Exactly. Well, guys, thanks. This has been a fascinating discussion. So thanks, Vandorn. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. Thank you,
And,
guys.
you know, we got some interesting courses coming up. If you're listening to this, academysacredgeometry.com, you can always join our database, our newsletter, and that's the way you'll find out about upcoming courses. If you're listening to this in the early part of 2023, we've got a great workshop coming up in March with Scott Olsen, and we'll keep you in touch with all of the wonderful events. And wonderful, Vandorn, we hope to see you again, and we
Yes,
hope to have some further discussions as well. This has been absolutely fascinating.
wonderful.
So thanks, guys.
Thank you.
We'll see
Good
you
to
soon.
Okay. Thank you.
Here.
Thank you.